Are you struggling with hair algae on your macroalgae, or are you struggling with one invasive species of macroalgae just completely taking over your tank and not allowing you to have the diversity of algae in your tank that you would like? Well, that's what we're talking about in this video. First of all then, we're going to look at hair algae growing on your macroalgae. This is a problem I see everywhere, and you can see this little section of Botrocladia is absolutely covered in hair algae. And whenever you see, or most of the times when you see Botrocladia in people's tanks, this is what it looks like. And of course, this isn't what it should look like. Here's a nice example of some Botrocladia looking pretty much in tip-top condition, and that's what we would like to see. The Botrocladia has little to zero other algae growing on it, and this is what it should look like. So then why has my other Botrocladia got hair algae all over it? Well, it's a difficult question to answer actually. I've had outbreaks of hair algae in my macroalgae systems. They've come and they've gone, and nothing's really changed environmentally, especially the lighting, or let's say the equipment doesn't change and the tank environment doesn't change in terms of flow. So what I put it down to really is two things: lack of cleaners, and also an error or an issue with your water quality. So starting with cleanup crew, I mean, there's only really 2 or possibly 3 species I would highly recommend for cleaning macroalgae. The first one is this guy here. This is the dove snail, the common dove snail, not the electric dove snail. I don't even really know if electric dove snails are that good at eating algae, but these guys are. These are dove snails, and they're actually a pest to a lot of people, but I find them to be a miracle when it comes to keeping macroalgae clean. I have them in all my tanks. You can see them at the back there. What they do is essentially get in and amongst all of the small fronds of your macroalgae. They multiply themselves, so you start with a couple and then you end up with hundreds. Obviously that depends on how much you have in terms of food for them. So if you've got lots of algae, you'll get lots of dove snails. Another thing are these guys. These are blue leg hermit crabs. Now specifically the blue legs are good because they stay small, and again they can get in and amongst your macroalgae. One issue with cleanup crew for macroalgae is the fact that a lot of macroalgae is quite weak when it comes to holding weight. So any of the larger snails or larger crabs, they won't really get up and amongst the tips. They won't get inside all of the different fronds, and that's why we go for small things like the dove snail and the blue leg hermits. And this is especially true when it comes to Botrocladia. There aren't many species that'll actually get up there and be able to clean the stems of your Botrocladia without eating it as well. But dove snails and blue legs are fit for this purpose. So interestingly though, I still got hair algae in this little section of my tank. And there's no real reason why I got hair algae in here. This tank has always really flourished for the last 2 years. I've had blue octodes algae growing in here, absolutely stunning, and various other things. But at some point something changed, because this tank up until maybe a month ago was riddled with hair algae, and I mean I could take handfuls of it out of there, but the rest of my systems didn't have hair algae. And you can see I also have plenty of dove snails in here, although they're not out at the moment, and I've also got blue leg hermit crabs amongst other species of hermit crab. So why then, if I've got perfect environment and also great cleanup crew, did I get hair algae? It is really difficult for me to pinpoint what happened in this particular area of my tank, because it was only to start with in this half section of this tank, which is connected to my other tanks here. I didn't get any hair algae in these sections, but I did in this section. And I think the only difference was the other algae in this tank weren't very established. I had a lot of racemosa in here and I kept removing it, and at one point I removed a lot of racemosa, and I think that just upset the balance in terms of who was using the nutrients, because there wasn't a lot of anything in here. When I dosed nutrients in my sump, I think in the other tanks which were established we had other algae in there just to suck that nutrient straight in, but in this tank, because it was relatively barren, the nutrients was able to sit in here, and the hair algae, being pretty much anything in here, took advantage and has taken over to a certain degree. In a really well established and well grown in macroalgae tank, you really shouldn't get any hair algae at all, because the macroalgae should outcompete it very easily. And I actually just solved this issue by adding some caulerpa into this tank. I've added taxifolia and I've added lentilifera. There are some other bits and pieces in here, like a little bit of blue octodes and so on, but it's since the caulerpa has started to grow and started to actually send out runners, the hair algae has disappeared. So I think I fixed my hair algae problem really with the addition of other macroalgae, faster growing macroalgae, to outcompete the hair algae. And that makes sense to me because it was only in that small section of tank where there wasn't really anything growing which caused me to have hair algae. That being said, I think a combination of a few things, which would be promoting your faster growing macroalgae to grow, making sure they've got the right lighting, the right nutrients, and obviously the right flow and filtration. And in that case, you shouldn't really get any hair algae. With the addition of a good complement of cleanup crew, this should easily solve your hair algae problems. As you can see in this 5-foot tank, there isn't a wisp of hair algae, and that's because it's really well matured, it's really well grown in, and all the macroalgae are growing in a very, very fast and healthy way. Now, there is an issue with this tank, and that leads me on to my next part of the video, which is when macroalgae start to grow on top of each other. And this can be an issue for a lot of people, and it's also one of the hardest things to manage, in my opinion, in a macroalgae tank. Now, this section of the video is really on a case-by-case basis, and it really does depend on how you want your macroalgae tank to look. If you want your macroalgae tank to look completely sort of unmanicured and natural, and you just don't really care what happens, and you want everything just to grow as it wants to grow, then you don't really need to watch the rest of this video, because that will just happen naturally. But I like to keep my macroalgae tanks a little bit manicured, not totally manicured, but I do like to keep my macroalgae species separate from each other. And I don't particularly like it when one thing starts to grow into another, where the other thing then starts to die. And that's what we're going to be talking about. The first problem with this tank, though, is a pest macroalgae, which really likes to grow on the stems of my red macros, and that is bubble algae. I'm talking about the green bubble algae, which is also called sailor's eyeballs. I mean, this really is an optional kind of thing. You don't have to worry about bubble algae, but it can take over to a certain extent. In a macroalgae tank, it is also another type of macroalgae, so you could just sit back and enjoy it. However, I'm finding that just like in a marine reef tank, it will become quite invasive and actually start to grow over pretty much everything that's reasonably slow growing. You can see here as well on some of my gracilaria, there is bubble algae, and personally I don't like this. So in terms of bubble algae, I'm finding it really difficult to control, just like everybody else. Now, in a marine reef tank, you would actually add some products like Brightwell Vibrant, and that would tend to kill off most of your bubble algae. But you can't do it in a display tank with macroalgae, because it will kill off the rest of your macro as well. So the only way I've managed to control this is to actually just hand pick it without trying to burst the bubbles, and it's very difficult. And in all honesty, I think the only way of managing this bubble algae is to be very rigorous in removing it before it becomes a problem. The next issue, which you can see in kind of a good example here, is the fact that macroalgae will colonize other macroalgae. In this example, we've got a bit of Cheeto growing there, we've got some red gracilaria, we've got some racemosa caulerpa, we've got some prolifera caulerpa, and there's some more green bubble algae, more Cheeto. So if I left this as it is now, just walked away and didn't do anything to it, what you would find would happen is I'd lose this section of Botrocladia in the long run. The three main species of algae that I'm worried about here is the racemosa, the red hair algae, and the Cheeto. Eventually what would happen is this Botrocladia would be strangled by these three different species, and I'd lose the Botrocladia quite quickly. So it's really important, if you want to keep your species alive in the long run, to do regular maintenance where you remove other species of algae. And that literally just means going through your algae once or twice a week and just pulling out other species that are growing in there. And you might think this is a bit laborious, and it can be, and you'll probably never get rid of every single piece, but you can see here I've removed that already, and if I left that, this Botrocladia would struggle in the long run. You can see on the Cheeto just how much it will strangle your Botrocladia and also other macroalgae. So really you need to go through and remove as much as you can. Another thing that can happen, especially with this red hair macroalgae, is it will grow into and onto the stems of other macroalgae, making it really difficult to remove. And in this case, all I would do is just snip off that section of stem and discard it. So I'd say doing that at least once a week will be a very important job to complete, because if you imagine if you didn't do it, if I didn't do it in this tank, this race mosa on the rock there would completely smother this tank probably in a couple of months. And that's something just to be aware of. If you want it looking in pristine condition for the long run, you're going to need to be like a natural predator amongst your tank, removing unwanted species when they start to encroach on each other. So thank you for watching. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have enjoyed it, please remember to leave a like and comment below, and also subscribe to my channel if you want to see more of this kind of content. Thanks to all my patrons and YouTube members. Once again, thanks for watching, and happy fish keeping.